Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. Not much left for me to say. So thank you. And thank you for having us at this really interesting conference. I think the paper that we want to discuss very well fits into the different themes that are discussed. So what we want to discuss today is kind of our small ongoing, or I shouldn't say small, but ongoing research projects that is on the vernacular web. So it's very much in process. So we would actually very much appreciate your feedback on our thoughts and our theories. So yeah, let's get into it. So whilst we are working on our respective PhDs and also with Matter of Imagination, Anya and I are trying to move into the concept of the vernacular web and what really is it. It's a term that I would say is kind of loosely used in academia to describe the early web in the 1990s. So in a sense, it's a scholarly notion that's used in internet studies and web histories based on empirical observations and theorizations. However, increasingly, we also saw that the vernacular web is used in contemporary internet critique. And we would argue that in a sense, it's an imaginary of the web that once was, very much fueled with affective relations and grounded in nostalgic sentiment. So people are longing for the web in the past. They want to recreate it and argue that we should go back to this web. And whilst this is the same concept and they are in dialogue with each other, we think that these are two different modes of engagement. And in our paper, we kind of want to dive into the relationships between them, juxtaposition them, and therefore separate them, because we think we are able then to more critically engage with them in the future. So how do we want to do it? Kind of in the core of our method or our framework is Ruth Levitas' Utopia as a Method book, in which she argues that constructed utopias have an archaeological mode. So in other words, if people want to produce a utopia or a vision, they tend to look into the past. So what we want to do in this paper is we want to look into contemporary internet critiques and see which kind of utopian visions from the past or images from the good society they used by digging for them ourselves. So in the paper, we are going to do 4 steps of ideological and discursive excavation, starting with academic scholarship on the early web, then moving into how this concept of the vernacular web is defined, where did it come from, and then moving really into how those visions have influenced the imaginary in contemporary art and activism. So that is also what we want to talk to you about today. We don't have a lot of time, so we want to go through each step and kind of show you what we're thinking about of doing. And yeah. So starting with utopian visions in historical texts. In the previous paper I worked on widely read academic publications and internet histories, I made an argument that a lot of literature from this time had revolutionary rhetoric and ontological tendencies, so trying to make sense of the web and also specifically of the web's potential. I identified 2 themes, understanding the web as a space, so having everything to do with immersion and spatial construction, but also understanding the web as a social technology that connects people. And in the second theme, you see the utopian idea of the virtual community emerge. It's a very well-known utopian idea, so I won't go into it that much. It's popularized by Howard Rheingold in his 1993 book, The Virtual Community Homesteading on the Electronic Frontier. And the book is about, and I quote here, fiercely independent enthusiasts who have created closely knit communities and a rich culture online. So you can already see in this sentence that it has a lot of revolutionary tendencies. And I think this book is very influential because, as Fligy argues, it kind of takes the web for the first time out of its purely technical space and into an ordinary social space. Interestingly, if you look into historiographical texts on this period of the web, you see that these utopian narratives are produced or reproduced. And what I found very interesting is that they are also actively juxtapositioning Web 1 and Web 2, arguing that we shouldn't forget Web 1 and Web 2 shouldn't overshadow what came before. So in this paper by Michael Stevenson, he's argued that against the claim that Web 2 technologies ushered a paradigm of participatory media, he debates that amateur participation vis-a-vis editorial control has also been very fundamental for the imagination of the web. So actively making this distinction between Web 1 and Web 2. This is not an isolated case. I have another example here by Megan Anderson, in which she again is arguing that the read-only publishing web, which I would say is Web 1, and Web 2, so the social media revolution, are of mutual influence for how we understand our contemporary social and commercial web. Then moving on to the concept of the vernacular web, in which we see, or we think we see, that these utopian narratives and scholarly texts about Web 1 become married with this idea of the vernacular. The vernacular is conceptualized in linguistics and found its way into cultural studies and cultural media studies. It has everything to do with bottom-up, grassroots, amateur creativity, outside institutional norms. There's some very influential scholarship on the screen. This term becomes kind of central in understanding the early 1990s web. So a decentralized web that has everything to do with the do-it-yourself ethos that is producing very specific web vernacular. So there's also an aesthetic realm and types of digital folklore. As I said in the beginning, the vernacular web is kind of a loosely used concept, and it pops up in literature kind of throughout the years. It's also used in conferences and other types of academic spaces, but we don't think it's that well defined, or it's defined in different ways. There are two examples of literature that use it to some extent on the screen. And this was really our starting point from how we want to continue the research.
Yeah, thank you, Nathalie. And I pick up from here. So although, like Nathalie already explained, vernacular is quite widely used in research as a certain notion, the vernacular web in particular has also evolved as a specific imaginary of the web's past within artistic and web design practice that is quite often also has something to do with internet criticism. And here we want to talk briefly about two cases where we see such imaginary develops. And I'm quite sure that some of you might be familiar with both cases, so we're curious what comments you might have at the end. And first case is a series of 3 essays by net artist and archivist Olle Lalina. They are called Vernacular Web and have been written between 2005 and 2010, where she describes what she calls, quote, disappearing aesthetic of the past, unquote. So in her essays, she kind of classifies different elements of web design that she attributes to an early web, like frames, background images of the night starry sky, different styles of homepages, and other things. And the essays are interesting in terms of genre because they're kind of bridging media theory, media aesthetics, but also artistic practice or artistic statements. They are positioned in between of many different things. But what's interesting for us here is that this essay brings a temporal dimension to the notion of vernacular web. It's not just anything that is not institutional or anything amateur, but for Lalina, vernacular web is the web of the past. It's an early web, defined very abstractly, very broadly, but it's something that we kind of have lost. So Lalina even uses a metaphor that I find very interesting here, maybe a bit of exoticized, and she says that it was the web of indigenous or the web of barbarians. Next slide, please. And the second case we want to talk about very briefly is the case of the Easter Web, which has been a group of people and an online project, or maybe we can even say that it was an online movement that roughly have existed between 2021 and 2023. And the Easter Web here, the name of it is a wordplay, which means the web of yesterday, the web of the past. So past here, the past of the internet, is approached with a very strong nostalgic and utopian sentiment. Participants of the movement, which were, there are different ideas how many participants there were, but I, for example, saw estimations that were about 5,000 or something in this direction. So participants were criticizing the web of now for its platformization, algorithms, commercialization, and other characteristics that they found unpleasant or politically not very fitting. And they used nostalgia to kind of turn to the web of the past and in nearly archaeological manner dig out some less mainstream web software, web design practices, or practices of being online that could have been an alternative, that could have been better. So they use nostalgia in kind of restorative manner. We can use a term by Svetlana Boym, restorative nostalgia here, to turn to the past to imagine the future. And the past here, the old web, is kind of blended with vernacular. There is no difference. The web of the past is the vernacular web. It's a web of amateur engagement, creativity, non-professional usage. So we really see very strongly the imaginary here, that the early web and the vernacular web just blend together. The next slide, please. So what is this vernacular web imaginary? In some ways, we can describe it as a longing for something more simple, for something more observable, for something more stable and predictable experience of being online, because all these characteristics. So it's not really about historical objectivity in these cases, but about digging into the past to shape a certain image of what a good life with the internet is. And if we try to define this good life, based on these cases, and actually we have more cases, but we don't have time to talk about all of them. So far, we speak about 4 main characteristics of what is a good life for authors of all these texts. First one is a very strong role of emotions and emotional engagement with online and playful engagement. So emotions like coziness or feeling of safety or feeling of creative freedom. Second one is access to a variety of non-commercial spaces where you don't have a targeted advertisement being pushed into your face, but you have many different options of how you exist online without your experience being commercialized right away. The third one is a value of reciprocal interactions and communal experience. So vernacular web in this imaginary is very, very communal. And the fourth characteristic is maybe a bit more aesthetical, but it's more complex than this, but it's independence from corporate design standards, from web design that is defined by big corporations or professional designers, but such interaction with the web that allows you to define how you want the web to look like and actively shape it. So by picturing the old web as vernacular web and vice versa, authors of these cases focus not on a historical phenomenon, but they create this romanticized imaginary of online life that relies on grassroots, amateur, and collective design practice. And of course, it's a very great way to think about the internet of the future and to define your values. But we as web historians know that the old web was not only vernacular, it has been commercial quite early on, and we had institutions, we had universities, we had businesses online from the very early years. So we see some kind of categorical confusion that happens here. Next slide, please. And this brings us back to what we started from, and we will want to finish with some open questions here because it's a work in progress. But this brings us back to this distinction between vernacular web as a scholarly notion and vernacular web as an imaginary. What is happening between them? How do we define between them? What do we want from noticing their difference? And we want to argue that the modes and goals of these two practices are different, and we should see them as different because separating them can be productive for both sides and could allow for a better communication between them. For the imaginary, the goal is not to learn how the web of the 90s or early 2000s actually looked like, but to imagine a better online future. By feeling nostalgic or longing for something missed, users can get a motivation to practically search for alternative ways of being online. In contrast to scholarship, there is no need for any objectivity, but on the contrary, imaginary profits from subjective perspectives, from emotional narratives, from value-driven experiments. And here, interculturality also comes in play because imaginary doesn't care about boundaries. There are no borders there. There are no particular cultures, but it can be imagined as a global thing. While in internet history, the actual focus on local histories is very, very important. So for scholars in general, it's much more strict when we want to talk about particular phenomena of the past. We need stricter definitions. And here's a question for us is, can we define vernacular web as a historical thing? Can we historize it in some way in which Olle Lerner is doing it? For example, to say that there was a particular kind of vernacular practice that was possible or prominent back then, but it's not possible or not prominent anymore. So how do we do it? Is it then a style? Is it a social phenomenon? Is it a historical period? And if we answer this question, we can have a more clear vision of whether we can historize this notion and how, and separate it better from the imaginary. So just to stress out at the end again, that the goal of defining the difference and separating them is not to diminish one or another, but to kind of help them interact with each other and help each other, because utopian thinking, of course, can help researchers formulate more socially relevant historical questions, and good historical practice can help utopian thinkers and visionaries to be more self-critical and more nuanced in their statements and practice. And this is kind of next task for us in our project, to do more work in like separating them in a more nuanced way. But we will leave it at this for now, and we are looking forward for your questions and comments. And one thing, we're not going to comment on it too much, but me and Nathalie have a call for papers open now about different ways how we can analyze imaginaries of the internet. And if you're interested, please take a look at it. We will be very happy to get your pitches. Thank you.